In Caracas, they study history to avoid it. In the war colleges of Venezuela, in the air-conditioned bunkers beneath Fuerte Tiuna, in the private clubs where aging generals smoke Cuban cigars and pretend the revolution still matters, the ghost of Manuel Noriega is never far from conversation. They remember December 1989. They remember how the Panamanian Defense Forces, flush with Soviet equipment and bravado, woke up to discover that American Special Operations Forces had materialized in their capital like apparitions. They remember the speed, the precision, the clinical erasure of a government in 72 hours. For 37 years, Venezuela's military leadership has promised itself, never again, never here, never us. But on January 27, 2026, history didn't repeat. It arrived with a silent rotor blade. And this time, it brought receipts. The Venezuelan generals had spent $14 billion on Russian hardware since 2005. $14 billion. That's not a typo, not propaganda inflation, not some Western estimate designed to make Moscow look good at the sales pitch. $14 billion in cold, hard petrodollars extracted from the oil fields of the Orinoco Belt and converted into surface-to-air missile batteries, radar stations, encrypted communication nodes, and the crown jewel of the entire arsenal. 4 batteries of the S-300 VM Anti-2500, the most advanced air defense system Russia was willing to export to a client state. The generals were told this was an impenetrable shield. Russian advisors, men with thick Slavic accents and folders full of performance data, showed them the charts. The S-300 VM could detect stealth aircraft. It could track cruise missiles at 200 kilometers. It could engage multiple targets simultaneously, creating a defensive bubble so dense that not even American fifth-generation fighters could penetrate without catastrophic losses. The system, they said, was designed to make stealth obsolete. The generals believed them. Why wouldn't they? The mathematics looked sound. The radar arrays stretched across the northern coastal range, their phased array antennae humming with kilowatts of radio frequency energy, scanning the sky in overlapping sectors. The missile launchers sat in hardened revetments, ready to send 9-meter-long projectiles screaming toward anything that dared enter Venezuelan airspace. On paper, on the glossy brochures that Moscow's Defense Export Agency distributed at arms fairs, the S-300 VM was a technological marvel. It was supposed to be the great equalizer, the weapon that turned a third-rate military into a fortress no superpower could crack. But there's a problem with buying your sovereignty from someone else. There's a problem with trusting that the hardware humming in your bunkers is actually loyal to you. And there's a problem with believing that stealth in 2026 is just a matter of radar-absorbent coatings and angular surfaces. Because stealth, real stealth, the kind that makes generals wake up screaming, isn't just about being invisible. It's about being irrelevant to the systems trying to see you. The helicopters came at 03:47 hours local time, 6 of them. Silent Hawks, though that designation is still classified and won't appear in any official Pentagon briefing for another decade. They entered Venezuelan airspace from the north, skimming the Caribbean at altitude so low that their rotor wash kicked up salt spray. They were painted in a color that doesn't exist in nature, a matte black so deep it seems to absorb light itself, treated with radar-absorbent polymers developed in laboratories where the security clearance starts at top secret and goes up from there. Their rotors were designed with acoustic suppression in mind, each blade shaped to minimize the telltale thump-thump-thump that has announced helicopter arrivals since Vietnam. The result is a sound profile that registers somewhere between a distant thunderstorm and the hum of industrial air conditioning, something your brain dismisses as background noise. They flew at 50 feet. 50. That's not a comfortable altitude for a pilot, or even with night vision and terrain-following radar. That's the altitude where a single miscalculation, a momentary lapse in concentration, turns your aircraft into a fireball and your crew into a closed-casket funeral. But it's also the altitude where you disappear. Radar is a line-of-sight technology. Radio waves don't bend around the curvature of the Earth. They don't magically hop over mountain ranges, and they sure as hell don't look down into the urban canyons of a city built into coastal hills. The S-300 VM's radar arrays, perched on hilltops and scanning the sky, were looking for threats at 10,000 feet, 20,000, 30,000. They were searching the high corridors where bombers cruise and where cruise missiles fly their programmed routes. They were not looking at the deck. The silent hawks threaded themselves through the Avila mountain range, using the terrain like a cloak. They followed the valleys, hugged the ridgelines, and when they reached the outskirts of Caracas, they dropped even lower. The lead pilot, a man whose name will never appear in any public record, guided his aircraft between apartment buildings, the rotor tips clearing balconies by meters. Civilians saw them. A woman smoking on her balcony in the Altamira district watched a black shape glide past her window, silent except for a low-frequency vibration she felt in her chest, more than heard with her ears. She would later tell her husband she thought she was hallucinating. A security guard at a shopping mall looked up from his phone to see a helicopter passing overhead, so close he could see the rivets on its fuselage. And then it was gone, was swallowed by the night. Inside Fuerte Tiuna, the central military command complex that sprawls across 200 acres in the heart of Caracas, the Situation Room was operating on routine alert status. The night shift officers monitored their screens with the bored attention of men who haven't seen real action in years. The radar displays showed the usual clutter. Commercial flights descending into Mekatía International, a Coast Guard patrol helicopter over the port, the ambient radio noise of a city of 3 million people. The S-300 VM batteries reported status green, all systems nominal, no threats detected. And then, at 03:52 hours, someone heard it. A sound, low, rhythmic, coming from outside. One of the duty officers, a colonel with 23 years of service and a stomach ulcer from too much coffee and not enough sleep, Mai stood up from his console and walked to the window. The bunker was partially underground, but there were reinforced glass panels that looked out onto the parade ground. He pressed his face close to the glass, cupped his hands around his eyes to block the interior lights, and stared into the darkness. He saw nothing, but he heard it. That sound, like a generator running or a transformer humming, but mobile, moving. He turned back to the radar operator. "Are you seeing anything?" The radar operator, a young lieutenant who'd been trained on the S-300 systems in Russia itself, shook his head. "Negative, sir. All sectors clear." The colonel frowned. He walked back to the window. The sound was louder now, closer. And then the lights went out. Not all the lights. The emergency systems kicked in immediately, bathing the Situation Room in red backup illumination. But the primary power grid, the feeds from the National Electricity Network, died in an instant, and with them went half the communication links, the secure phone lines, the internet connections to the outlying radar stations. The backup generators roared to life, but there was a gap, a precious few seconds of silence, where the only sound in the bunker was the breathing of terrified men. The radar screens flickered, rebooted, came back online, still showing nothing. The colonel grabbed the handset of the secure line to the S-300 battery commander at Fort Mara. The line was dead. He tried the backup frequency, static. He tried the satellite link, nothing. One of the junior officers shouted from across the room, "Sir, we have reports of helicopters, multiple helicopters. Low altitude, inside the city." "From where?" "Civilian calls, social media, someone's posting videos." The colonel's blood went cold. He turned to the air defense coordinator. "Why the hell aren't we tracking them?" The coordinator stared at his screen, his face pale in the red light. "Sir, the system says there's nothing there." "Then the system is wrong." But it wasn't wrong. Not exactly. The S-300 VM was operating exactly as designed. Its radar arrays were scanning the sky, pumping out megawatts of radio energy, listening for the faint echoes that would indicate an incoming threat. The problem was that the threat was below the radar horizon, flying so low that the curvature of the Earth itself blocked the line of sight. The VHF band radars, the long wavelength systems that were supposed to detect stealth aircraft by brute force, were optimized for high-altitude intercepts. They were looking at the sky. The helicopters were threading through the streets, but even if the radars had seen them, even if by some miracle the Silent Hawks had popped up above a ridgeline and presented a targetable signature, it wouldn't have mattered, because the S-300 VM batteries weren't just blind. They were compromised. Shadowlink is not a term you'll find in any official documentation. It's not a program with a budget line or a congressional oversight committee. It's a protocol, a series of authentication backdoors embedded in the hardware supply chain of foreign military systems. The Russians know about it, or at least they suspect. The Chinese definitely know, because they've done the same thing to their own export models. When you buy a weapons system from a foreign power, you're not just buying metal and circuitry, you're buying a relationship, you're buying dependency, and sometimes you're buying a remote kill switch. The S-300 VM batteries defending Caracas were equipped with imported components, processor chips fabricated in Taiwan, capacitors from Malaysia, radar modules assembled in Belarus but using Western electronic components smuggled through third-party suppliers. Somewhere in that supply chain, at some factory or warehouse or shipping container, extra lines of code were added to the firmware. Authentication protocols that allowed a specific encrypted signal to override the system's targeting logic. Not shut it down, nothing so crude as that. Just instruct it to ignore certain radar returns, to classify them as friendly, to look the other way. At 0349 hours, 3 minutes before the Silent Hawks entered Caracas airspace, a burst transmission from a satellite in geosynchronous orbit tickled the S-300's communication receivers. The transmission lasted 8 milliseconds. It contained no information a human analyst would recognize as meaningful. But deep in the missile battery's computer core, a subroutine activated. A digital handshake completed. And the system was told, in language it understood perfectly, that the helicopters approaching from the north were not threats. The generals in the bunker didn't know this. They couldn't know this. All they knew was that their billion-dollar shield was showing green lights while they could hear the enemy circling overhead. The lead Silent Hawk settled into a hover over the parade ground at Fuerte Tiuna. Its side doors slid open. Ropes deployed. Men in black tactical gear descended, their movements smooth and practiced, rehearsed 1,000 times in mock-ups and simulators until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. They hit the ground running, flowing toward the bunker entrance with the coordinated precision of a choreographed dance. Behind them, the helicopter lifted off, banking away to provide overwatch while the second aircraft moved into position. Inside the bunker, the colonel made a decision. He grabbed his sidearm, a Russian-made Makarov pistol that had never been fired outside a range, and ran for the stairs leading to the surface. 2 of his junior officers followed him. They burst through the blast doors onto the parade ground and found themselves face to face with a nightmare. The helicopters were everywhere, not just hovering, not just circling, landing. Deploying troops, establishing a perimeter. The colonel raised his pistol, a gesture so futile it bordered on tragic, and one of the American operators casually leveled a rifle at him. Not aggressively, not with malice, just a professional reminder that resistance would be brief and painful. The colonel lowered his weapon. His hands were shaking. Behind him, the bunker doors opened again. A general emerged. Older, gray-haired, wearing a uniform festooned with medals from conflicts he'd never actually fought in. He looked at the Americans, then at the helicopters, then at the skyline of Caracas where more black shapes were visible, moving between buildings like predators stalking prey. He said in slow, careful English, This is sovereign Venezuelan territory. The American operator didn't respond. He just stood there, rifle ready, more night vision goggles pushed up on his helmet, waiting. The general tried again. You have no right to be here. Still nothing. And then, from somewhere behind the American perimeter, a voice called out in Spanish, fluent and unaccented. General, please instruct your men to stand down. We're not here for a fight. The general turned. A figure approached, dressed in civilian clothes, carrying no visible weapon. An intelligence officer. CIA, probably, though the distinction hardly mattered. The man's face was calm, almost friendly. Your air defenses have been neutralized, the intelligence officer said. Your communications are down. Your chain of command is severed. We control the airspace, we control the bunker, and in about 90 seconds, we're going to control the presidential palace. You can make this easy, or you can make it difficult, but the outcome is the same. The general's jaw worked. He wanted to argue, wanted to invoke international law, sovereignty, the dignity of the Venezuelan armed forces, but the words died in his throat because he knew, with absolute certainty, that none of it mattered. The Americans had done in 12 minutes what his entire military couldn't prevent with $14 billion of Russian hardware. He lowered his head. "Stand down," he said quietly. The horror wasn't in the invasion itself. Militaries lose battles. Governments fall. History is littered with the wreckage of regimes that thought themselves invincible. The horror was in the realization that the battle had never even started. The S-300 batteries, the radar networks, the encrypted communications, the hardened bunkers, all of it was theater. An expensive, elaborate illusion of defense that evaporated the moment it was tested. In Beijing, analysts at the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force were watching satellite imagery of Caracas when the operation began. They watched the heat signatures of the Silent Hawks appear on infrared, moving through the city like ghosts. They watched the Venezuelan air defense network remain dormant. They ran the numbers, calculated the radar horizons, estimated the stealth coefficients, and then they opened classified files on their own S-400 batteries, domestically produced variants with Chinese electronics and Chinese firmware, and they started asking very uncomfortable questions. In Moscow, in the offices of Almazante, the defense contractor that built the S-300 VDM, engineers received urgent queries from their liaison officers. Oh, why didn't the system engage? Was there a malfunction? A design flaw? The engineers reviewed the telemetry data that had been transmitted back to Russia from the Venezuelan batteries. Everything looked normal. The radars were functioning. The missiles were ready. The targeting computers were online. It just didn't see anything. Or rather, it saw exactly what it was told to see. The Panama Protocol, as it would later be called in classified briefings, wasn't about overwhelming force. It wasn't about shock and awe, about carpets of bombs or waves of fighters. It was about precision, about exploiting the gaps between what a defensive system is designed to do and what it can actually accomplish. The S-300 VM was built to stop high-altitude bombers and cruise missiles, threats from the Cold War playbook. It was never designed to counter helicopters flying at rooftop level through urban terrain. And more importantly, it was never designed to operate independently of the supply chain that created it. This is the uncomfortable truth of modern warfare. Sovereignty is an illusion when your defense is built from someone else's parts. You can train your soldiers, drill your officers, fortify your bunkers, and paint your equipment in national colors. But if the microchips in your radar come from Taiwan, if the firmware was compiled in a facility with American oversight, if any component of your defensive network passed through a supply chain that can be compromised, then you don't control your own defense. You're renting it, and the landlord can evict you whenever they choose. The Venezuelan generals learned this lesson at 03:47 hours on January 27, 2026. They learned it in the most visceral way possible, standing in their bunker while enemy helicopters landed on their parade ground, and their multi-billion-dollar air defense system reported that everything was fine. They learned it while watching green screens that promised security while reality crashed through their doors. The operation lasted 43 minutes. By 0430 hours, the primary objectives were secured. The presidential palace was surrounded. The military command structure was decapitated. The air defense network, still technically operational, was irrelevant. The Silent Hawks extracted with the same precision they'd arrived, lifting off into the pre-dawn darkness and disappearing over the Caribbean. By the time the sun rose over Caracas, the only evidence they'd been there at all were the boot prints in the parade ground dust and the traumatized faces of the generals who'd watched their world end in real time. In Washington, in the secure conference rooms beneath the Pentagon, analysts compiled their after-action reports with clinical satisfaction. The Panama Protocol had worked exactly as designed. More importantly, it had worked in front of an audience. Chinese satellites had watched. Russian intelligence had taken notes. Every military in the world that relied on imported defense systems was now doing the same mental math, asking the same terrible question. If it happened in Caracas, could it happen to us? The answer, which no one wanted to say out loud but everyone understood, was yes. The Taiwan Strait is 8,000 miles from Caracas. The geography is different. The political stakes are higher. The military forces involved are exponentially more capable. But the fundamental equation is the same. China's air defense network, the integrated system of radars and missiles and early warning stations that guards its coastline, is built on the same principles as Venezuela's. More sophisticated, certainly. More redundant, better maintained, but still reliant on components that passed through a global supply chain, still vulnerable to the same shadow link protocols, still optimized for the wrong kind of threat. The generals in Beijing know this. They've known it for years, but knowing and experiencing are different things. Watching the Venezuelan defenses collapse in real time. Watching a Russian system fail to detect American aircraft flying through the heart of a capital city, that's not abstract knowledge. That's a preview. In Caracas, in the weeks after the operation, there were investigations. Officers were questioned. The Russian advisors were summoned to explain what went wrong. The radar logs were analyzed. The missile battery commanders were interviewed, and everyone reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. The system worked exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed for this. The Venezuelan government quietly began negotiations. Not surrender, nothing so formal. Just conversations about transitions and guarantees and the orderly transfer of power. The generals, those who remained in their positions, understood the situation. They could fight, certainly. They had infantry and tanks and all the traditional tools of conventional war. But without air defense, without the ability to prevent the enemy from operating freely in their own sky, all of that was just target practice. The S-300 VM batteries were shut down 3 weeks later. Not destroyed, not sold, just deactivated and mothballed. There was no point in maintaining a system that had proven itself worse than useless. The radar arrays fell silent. The missile launchers were towed back to their storage facilities. $14 billion of cutting-edge Russian military technology was reduced to expensive scrap metal, because when it mattered most, when the moment came to justify its existence, it had failed absolutely. The manufacturers blamed the operators. The operators blamed the manufacturers. The Russians blamed the Americans for cheating, for using unfair tactics, for exploiting weaknesses that shouldn't exist. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the outcome. The Silent Hawks had come and gone, and the most advanced air defense system Russia could export had never even seen them. This is the new calculus of sovereignty in 2026. It's not about flags or borders or declarations of independence. It's about control, real control. Control over your own defense, your own technology, your own ability to resist. And if that control rests on hardware you didn't build, software you didn't write, and components you can't verify, then you don't have sovereignty. You have the appearance of sovereignty. A carefully maintained fiction that lasts exactly as long as the people who sold you that hardware decide to let it continue. The generals in Caracas learned this lesson. The generals in Beijing are learning it now. And every military commander in every country that has ever imported a weapon system from a foreign supplier is looking at their own defenses and wondering, when the Silent Hawks come for us, will our systems work? Or will they, like the S-300 VM in Venezuela, simply look the other way and leave us standing alone in the dark, listening to the sound of rotor blades circling overhead? The answer, written in the smoking ruins of Venezuelan air defense doctrine, is already known. The only question is whether anyone else will learn it before their own bunker lights go out and their own radar screens betray them. History doesn't repeat. It doesn't need to. It just finds new ways to deliver the same brutal lesson. In modern warfare, the most dangerous thing you can be is a customer of someone else's security. The second most dangerous thing is believing that customer relationship will protect you when it matters most. On January 27, 2026, the Venezuelan generals didn't lose a war. They lost something far more fundamental. They lost the illusion that sovereignty could be purchased, that defense could be imported, that security could be bought from a catalog and installed like furniture. They learned in the most visceral way possible that when your shield is made of compromised silicon and foreign firmware, you're not defending yourself. You're just waiting for permission to be conquered, and when that permission is revoked, when the authentication codes are transmitted and the backdoors are opened, all that's left is the sound of helicopters landing on your parade ground, and the terrible understanding that your billion-dollar defense was always just an expensive way to guarantee your own defeat.